Well, folks, let's talk about some murdered cards. Because, as always, Onyxia's Lair has come along and released some cards that, in one way or another, have put some old cards to shame. Like you can see behind me here with Kazakhstan and Archivist Elysiana. Now, before we get into the details, we're going to take a look at our sponsor for this video. It's the Opera GX browser. The Opera GX browser is the perfect browser for gamers thanks to features like GX Control. It lets you limit the amount of CPU or RAM the browser is using to make sure you can use those resources on your games instead. And you can actually limit your network as well to make sure you're not hogging that connection. Another great thing about Opera GX is all the customization. You can make it look exactly how you want. You got themes, wallpapers, and lots of shiny colors. There's also the GX Corner, which can help you stay up to date on latest games and offer you free games. And finally, if you didn't know, the Opera GX browser is now on mobile and can be connected to the desktop version. So if you want to check out Opera GX, you can hit my link down there in the description. It's free and you can grab it for desktop or mobile. Just be sure to add a bookmark to my YouTube channel. All right, so let's take a look at these murdered cards, starting off with Kazakhstan and Archivist Elysiana. And really, Kazakhstan is just a faster, more dramatic version of what Elysiana did in the past. They both can serve as this like anti-fatigue protection. That's how Elysiana was played back in the day in like Control Warriors. They'd get to the bottom of their deck, play this, extend 10 cards, generate value, prevent fatigue. Kazakhstan can do that. He can do the exact same thing. Wait till the bottom of your deck for the same cost, better stats, and instead of picking a bunch of random garbage in your deck, you get to put treasures in your deck. And on top of that, Kazakhstan's cards are so good, you play Kazakhstan as early as possible because it's almost always going to win you the game just because the quality of your draws are so high. There's so much crazy burst damage. So Kazakhstan can do everything that Elysiana did well, but he also has this entirely other way better win condition. That's why we see him in Druid decks getting played on like turn 4. Who cares about waiting to fatigue? Just get those treasures ASAP. Now, throughout this video, we're going to talk about a lot of cards that aren't necessarily problematic evolutions. In fact, they're like really cool, healthy, new ways to take on an old design. Kazakhstan might be one of those that's trending a little bit towards problematic because when he comes down early in those like Druid matchups, for instance, it feels kind of hopeless sometimes to play against him. And I think a lot of people would almost prefer Kazakhstan worked like Elysiana, like you had to have an empty deck, or maybe you had to actually have some dragons in deck, for instance, or maybe it transformed your dragons into treasures, basically some kind of limiters, because it seems like Kazakhstan might have evolved a little too far and gotten a little too strong, currently being played in about 40% of Hearthstone decks. Druids are pretty darn good running Kazakhstan. So I wonder if this is actually kind of a dangerous power creep situation, very much unlike our next example here, which you may have forgotten this was actually a card that just came out. This is Shoulder Check for Warrior. I've never actually seen this card get played, and I'm comparing it to another card you may have forgotten about. This is the 1 mana version of Charge. After Charge got nerfed for a while there, it was 1 mana, and it gave a friendly minion charge. It can't attack heroes this turn. Now, today that's just called Rush, but this was before Rush. So for a while there, it was 1 mana, give a minion rush functionally. But nowadays, of course, we have Shoulder Check, which is 1 mana, give a minion rush, but it also gets +2/+1, and Shoulder Check has tradable. So there are multiple ways this card just completely stomps on Charge. Now, of course, that 1 mana Charge was not a problematic card. It was totally underpowered, completely useless, laughably bad, and Shoulder Check certainly does not seem to be like a problematic advancement there. This is not a situation where power creep is at all a concern. In fact, Shoulder Check might also be a fairly low-powered card. So I think this is a much more interesting design, much more playable design without trending towards being too strong. This to me feels like a fantastic evolution of what Charge was back in the day for that moment, where it was just completely unplayably terrible and useless. So next up, we have another, I think, cool example of a card that is a good change. This is a move in the right direction because Mida Pure Light is a much stronger and more synergistic version of Waxadread. Back in the day, you might remember Waxadread. I always loved the idea of Waxadread, but for rogue decks, it was really hard for them to extract a lot of use out of Waxadread. It was just kind of slow and passive, and like it's kind of this like permanent threat that kept coming back, but ultimately it wasn't all that hard to deal with or all that synergistic with other rogue packages. There was like some dragon stuff going on in rogue back then that wasn't great. Whereas with Mida, you have the same sort of effect. This keeps coming back on the board, but with Mida, Priest loves these kinds of things, right? Because Death Rattle synergies exist. You can get multiple Midas getting resummoned. And then you've got Lifesteal here as well. So it's great for slower decks that want to have some stabilization, some life gain. It works out perfectly. So it becomes this really relevant threat on board, essentially, for your opponents to kind of have to deal with. Otherwise, you're going to heal off of it. And then the stickiness with Divine Shield is great for any kind of buffs that Priest might be able to pull off. So essentially, by taking the same kind of minion, adding a meager 1 mana cost to it, but giving it some great keywords and some real synergies, it just feels like such a better fit. And here's the crazy thing. Mida's not overpowered at the moment. It's actually not even really being played all that much. So even though this card got amped up a ton, it still feels totally fair and fine. And I think a much more fun version of Waxadread in most ways. So until this gets broken someday with some crazy Res Priest, Death Rattle Priest shenanigans as it might, for now I'm going to say that Mida is just a much better way to do Waxadread. That's a far better fit for its class. And then next up here, we have Wings of Hate for Demon Hunter, another card I haven't seen a lot of just yet, not getting much play according to HS Replay so far. It's a 1 mana summon 2 1/1 Fell Wings, and that upgrades to 3 and 4 Fell Wings at 5 and 10 mana. So clearly, at 1 mana, it's about the same as Lost in the Jungle or a card like Alley Cat. You could say Wolpertinger as well, although that has some interesting kind of buff upside. And then it scales, right? So it gets better in the late game. If you top deck this on turn 10 somehow, you've made it that far as a Demon Hunter running Wings of Hate, congratulations, then you get extra minions, whereas you don't with Lost in the Jungle or Alley Cat. So clearly it has some upside. Now, notably, you know, those are both like Beast synergies, Silverhand Recruit synergies. You might say those have more synergies to extract, but actually Token Demon Hunter is technically a very synergistic package as well. You can use these wide boards to do lots of things. So I would argue Wings of Hate has similar sorts of synergistic upside. Now, here's the crazy thing though, despite Wings of Hate being, you know, a better version, it's still worse than this, which actually already came out in the last mini set. Wicked Shipment for Warlock actually still kind of eclipses all of these, because I would argue it's much, much more easily upgraded than Wings of Hate. You can kind of do it on demand. Tradable gives it a lot of flexibility, and it gets to full boards of imps as well, because you're upgrading it so substantially every time, and it still has that same base stat line and the base synergies of being demons and imps. So this is like the ultimate evolution, whereas Wings of Hate, despite surpassing these in a lot of ways, is still kind of stuck in the middle. So it's interesting how many different versions of this sort of design exist. You also had Living Roots. That was cool because the choose one, deal two, that gave it some additional upsides, right? So we've seen this design sliced about 17 different ways. And Wings of Hate, I think, lands somewhere in the middle as far as power level is concerned, although certainly not getting played. Next up here is Pet Collector versus Ram Wrangler. And I think this is a really cool showcase of how like specificity in design can go a long way. So Ram Wrangler, if you don't remember from the Grand Tournament, super old card, 5 mana 3/3. If you have a beast on board, you summon a random beast. So you can get a 1/1 or you can get a King Crush, right? But on average, you're going to get smaller stuff. A lot of beasts are smaller, and you have to have this condition of a beast on board. So sometimes, you know, if you're on an empty board, you can't just plop this guy down on 5. You got to kind of support him, spend some mana alongside him. So he was both this sort of restricted, hard to work with, and then, you know, really random result that often trended towards fairly weak. And, you know, the high rolls were fairly rare back in the day. Whereas with Pet Collector, it fixes so many design problems. Same base cost and stats, right? But here, you're getting a specific beast from your deck. It's an incredibly consistent result because you're able to build toward it. You know, if you build your deck correctly, it's going to be a 5 mana beast as well. So you can make sure that it's going to be worth the mana cost, essentially. Whereas Ram Wrangler sometimes is sitting dead because you don't have the beast to help activate it, and then you also low roll off of it. So it's got these RNG downsides, these inconsistency problems, its conditionality. Pet Collector doesn't have any of that. It works as long as you build your deck for it, which encourages deck building, some foresight and forethought. You can have a reliable tool in hand. So, it's just a much cooler version of the similar kind of design that I think is much better for Hearthstone 2 because it's strategically rewarding. And then next up is the super obvious. There's always one of these, right? Where it's just oh yeah, this is a drastically better version of a terrible basic vanilla sort of card, because clearly Whelp Bonker here gets a lot of upside versus something like Amgam Rager. And clearly this is a healthy evolution. Obviously cards like Amgam Rager shouldn't exist. And I wanted to use this as a showcase to talk about that, because back in the day, we got those kinds of garbage filler cards all the time, where there's just man, why is this in the game? Why do I have to deal with these sorts of cards? Whereas nowadays, the sort of filler stuff, the just, neutral card packages often have some interesting keywords and mechanics and designs that, even though they're not powerful or particularly useful necessarily in the meta, they might still have some fringe use case, or when they get randomly summoned, they're more interesting. Creates all these divergent gameplay experiences, which I think are really nice. So I'm glad that the kind of bottom of the design for Hearthstone has been brought up, notably in regards to complexity, because I want cards like Whelp Bonker as opposed to cards like Amgam Rager filling out my collection. And then finally here, we've got Onyxia versus Raid Boss Onyxia. And clearly, since Raid Boss Onyxia is facing left, it's a much better version of OG Onyxia, because that's just facing right. And who cares about right-facing cards? We like left-facing cards on this channel. But of course, for one extra mana here, Raid Boss Onyxia gets so many crazy, substantial upgrades. I mean, just ridiculous how much better she is, right? So OG Onyxia, to remind you, just summons 1/1s. That's it, right? She's an 8/8. She summons a bunch of 1/1s. This is not the other core set Onyxia that continues to summon 1/1s. That one, you could argue, has some long-term upside, but these two compared, it's pretty obvious. 2/1s with Rush are way stronger than 1/1s without Rush, because this gives this card a lot of reactivity. Suddenly it can be a board clear. And then, of course, obviously, the immune Onyxia can create tons of upside and shenanigans because she has Rush as well. So you can clear big stuff, little stuff, a mix. You can create just a monster board threat where it's God, I can't deal with that immune Onyxia. And that makes her a relevant 10-drop. She's actually getting played, which it's so hard for high cost cards to get played in Hearthstone. And I think they found a great spot for Onyxia, where it's not totally game winning, but it's still meaningful. It's reactive enough. It's threatening enough that it is in that sweet spot where it's a card that classes like Druid can run and actually have that rewarding way to spend mana. And yeah, of course, this is not a 1-to-1 comparison because it's 1 mana extra, but functionally 9s and 10s kind of serve the same roles in Hearthstone. And I think anybody who's thinking about it carefully is pretty happy to pay 1 mana for all these ridiculous improvements that you get with Raid Boss Onyxia. So I think this is a great evolution of a character, taking the really simple design of Onyxia, amping everything up, and making it an actual relevant card. That is a great success as far as I'm concerned. And there you go. That wraps it up here for these murdered cards. Some pretty interesting stuff to think about. Overall, I think great changes, right? I think these are all positive advancements as far as Hearthstone design is concerned. Kazakhstan might be a little power crept, but everything else I think actually was a home run. Great success, great evolution of all these sorts of card shapes and styles and functions. So that said, I'm curious, what do you think about these? Are they good for the game, bad for the game? Is it power creep? Is it healthy? What's your take on all of that? Share that in the comments below. But until then, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.